Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 3, Running in the Wind. The ancient red house, which had stood silent so long, was now suddenly full of life and bustle. Where there had been so much of shadows and silence before, a great adventure was just beginning, and strange, bright hopes were darting and lifting everywhere, just as the swallows had so long been darting and soaring about the eaves and above the great chimney. Louisa, standing on the doorstone, had only one feeling about this new place, to which they had so surprisingly come. It would make a glorious playground. Those unbroken fields sloping to the river, how she was going to run and race across them. Concord had seemed to give her freedom, but now it was nothing to what she would have here. Even before she left Boston, she had become something of a champion in the way of hoop rolling, and at the age of 6, she could drive her hoop all the way around the common without a stop. In Concord, she had developed that art to so great a height that one day she ran and trundled to the foot of Hardy's Hill, a mile from home, then turned without stopping and rolled the hoop back again. There were greater feats before her now, however, so that hoop rolling seemed a very distant and a very tame enterprise, alongside of what she would find to do here. She was well grown for a girl of 11, with legs beginning to be very long like a colt's, and which felt frisky as a colt's do. They had always skipped a little, all of themselves, as she walked along. Even after the long day of travel, they could have skipped and run, but she must go in, for her mother was calling her to supper. The twilight creeping up the valley, the misty vision of the mountains, both were beautiful to watch, but better still was the blaze and crackle of the fire in the huge chimney place. All of the travelers were thoroughly ready for supper of brown bread and roasted potatoes served on tin plates, since as yet no china had arrived. Louisa watched her father, thin-faced and clear-eyed, as he sat with the rosy light shining upon his mild countenance. She saw him partaking of his share quietly, solemnly, as though he were under a spell. The very food before him seemed to be a mark of the beginning of the great experiment, the undertaking which, according to his belief, was to make the world a different and a finer place in which to dwell. They were to live the perfect life here, and to show others that life could be lived perfectly. He ate as though he were in a dream. Abba moved here and there, intent only on the fact that they had actually arrived, with bundles and kettles and blankets and confusion all about them. The eyes of the children were falling shut from weariness, and from a whole day of driving in the fresh, clean air. The baby, they called May the baby still, although she was actually 3 years old, was already asleep. Elizabeth, plump and 8, was very nearly so. The big, dark eyes of Anna were drooping. Louisa's, for a little longer, were still wide awake and alert. Her father got up, put away his plate, and spoke. He was embarking upon one of those earnest conversations which were to be such a great part of the life of this new place, the discussion of all things under the sun. He began a little fable which was to appeal to the small members of the household and yet carry a meaning to everyone there. Louisa never heard the final message of that tale. The long day in the open air brought its expected end at last, and she was led away, blind with sudden sleepiness, to her bed. The tired mother, who had thought of everything, had managed somehow, and there were beds of a sort made up on the floor, into which she could tuck the children, just as she had tucked them in the cottage in Concord, which now seemed left so far behind. As we follow the daily life of this odd company through the weeks and months, we may be tempted to think with a smile of the ideas which were the foundation of this new life. We must remember, however, that Bronson and his friends, wise in some ways, mistaken in others, had the courage to find out by the only possible means where they were right and where they were wrong. There is only one method for testing a system of living, that is, by living it. The year 1843 was the end of the period, very like that which has become all too familiar to us 90 years later. Long wars involving both Europe and America had brought their slowly arriving results of poverty, unemployment, and bewildered suffering. Something was very wrong with the world, everyone said. Here and there, a few were trying to organize totally new schemes of living. So many were tried then that we do not have to try them all over. So many were tried then that we do not have to try them over again today. This company at Fruitlands thought that private property was wrong and that everything must be owned in common. They followed the principle that animals must not be killed for men's subsistence, and must not even be forced to labor for man. They got up at first light bathed in cold water, and ate the same food they had partaken of in Concord: vegetables, bread, fruit, and grain porridge. Breakfast was apt to be hurried and lunch eaten in weary silence, but there was a carefully observed rule that, as they dined in the evening, they must talk of higher things. The men wore linen smocks, since wool robbed the sheep of cotton. Since wool robbed the sheep, and cotton was produced by slave labor. They made their firmest stand of all against slavery. There was much laughter in the old place, since 4 growing little girls can make it impossible for even a company of philosophers to be entirely solemn. There was in every corner that bright content that comes to a place when people are happy. All through the summer, Louisa spent glorious days, waking when the first red showed above the mountains, and running out into the sparkle of sunshine on dewy fields. As the fresh morning wind would come down from the hills, she would turn so that it was behind her and go racing down the long slopes, feeling so well, so light, and so fleet that it was as though the wind could go no faster than she. Sometimes she sat in the shadow of a great clump of pines and heard the breezes sing, deep-voiced, in the branches. She would come in from these excursions, bright-eyed and rosy, to work beside quiet, industrious Anna at the tasks of the house. Here was all the pleasure and excitement which comes to every young person who spends the summer on a farm. The animals, it was necessary at last to bring in the aid of oxen to break the stubborn hill acres. The miracle of the growing seeds and dark furrows turning green, the black crows flapping overhead, the smell of blueberries with sun on them, the solemn-faced woodchuck sitting upright amongst the stones, all these were a new and continued delight to the girls. Louisa and Anna had the feeling not merely that it was an alluring life, but that there was the zest of a strange adventure, combined with the ordinary round of labor. They understood that the undertaking was unlike anything that had ever happened before, and that somehow they, the 2 girls, had an actual part in it. They carried on their own share of the work in the farmhouse. Anna with a good deal of skill for a girl of 12, Louisa still eagerly and awkwardly, both of them determined to be of help to their mother. What they did was an odd mixture of pleasure and toil. Anna could bake bread, and she and Louisa could get a meal without older help. Anna would go for a walk in the woods and come home with a shining face, unable to speak of all the beautiful things which she had seen. "My favorite word is beautiful," she wrote in her diary. Both the elder children would help with the washing and ironing, and then would go out and gather blueberries and blackberries in the thickets on the rocky slopes above them. Anna gave lessons to her sisters, but she was also not too old to play fairies with them in the mossy clearings of the pine wood, or to gather oak leaves and flowers to make wreaths for every one in the household. At the end of the day, both little girls would write in their journals, Anna filling hers with quiet, pleasant reflections and a record of the work she had done, Louisa covering her blotted pages with accounts of her turbulent thoughts, of her glorious runs on the hill, with the wind all about her, and alas, of her quarrels with Anna, of their recollections, and of her grief over the bad temper which would not be controlled. She was to find very early, and was to know until very late, that it was hard to be good. Abba Alcott, tried and hard-pressed, did not always know how to calm the sudden storms. Bronson almost always could, no matter what had been the small differences. The day always ended in peace, and with an unbroken knowledge between the 2 girls of how much they loved each other. They went to bed in the little room under the roof, listening to the sounds above, to the wind sliding by overhead, or stirring in the tall elm trees, or to the steady rain on the shingles so close above their heads. Louisa was excitable, and sometimes was so full of the events of the day that she would lie in the dark, broad awake. She would recite poetry to herself until presently the rhymes and rhythms would mix with the rustling of leaves or the patter of rain, and she would be asleep. They would walk to the mill and watch the water go splashing over the dripping wheel, and see the smooth stream slide quietly over the dam and plunge white and glittering in the sun into the pool below. They would help rake the hay and carry it to the waiting cart. They would go up to the wood and build bowers of twigs and ferns for their dolls. On rainy days, they would both curl up in the big kitchen and read endlessly. In the evenings, Bronson would not be too tired to get out the beloved book and read aloud, in the light of the bayberry candles, the story of which Louisa spoke in her diary as Dear Pilgrim's Progress. Then at last, when it was bedtime again, he would put down the book, look about with his mild, radiant smile, and ask, "What is God's noblest work?" They must all answer, the older philosophers, Charles Lane and Abram Wood and Joseph Palmer, and also the children, Anna reflectively, Louisa impulsively, sweet round little Elizabeth sleepily, Abba Alcott, who had toiled without ceasing for a moment since daylight, would be sitting by the single lamp, sewing as though her life depended upon it. She was the only woman there, and hers was the only really able pair of hands for the tasks of preparing food, sweeping, washing, and keeping all this household clothed. The questions went round from one to another, but she did not answer. It was agreed that she was to be excused, that she had other things of which to think. Louisa was growing so rapidly that she was beginning not to know at all what to do with her long arms and legs. She still thought that running on a hill was the most glorious thing in the world, and yet it was strangely beautiful to sit longer and longer at the edge of the woods, looking down on fruitlands and wondering, not as to what was God's noblest work, or what was the nature of man, not about any of the things talked of by philosophers before the fire, but wondering and wondering still. There is a certain incident belonging to Louisa's early years, which it is very difficult to place in regard to time. It made so deep an impression upon her, and she spoke of it so often afterwards, that it cannot be omitted from any account of her life, even though there is no record of just when it happened. It shall be told here. One day, as she stood in the kitchen, she heard a strange sound in the brick oven, before cooking stoves came into use, and when open fires were still the only means for preparing food. It was usual, when there was a large chimney, to take the space next to the fire for a bricked-in oven with an iron door. Wonderful cooking was possible in those old ovens. There are indeed certain kinds of bread which cannot be baked successfully in any other way. Louisa knew that no such noise was appropriate to the baking of bread. Curiosity possessed her, and she opened the door and peeped in. A face looked out at her, a black face, gaunt and as wild and desperate as a hunted animal's. She jumped back, slammed the door, and ran to her mother. Abba told her in a whisper there was a man hidden in the oven. A contraband. Louisa was to say nothing of what she had seen, since even the people in the house who knew of such a presence did not talk of it to one another for fear of being overheard. Contraband was the name given to those runaway slaves who managed to slip away from the plantations of the South and make their way to freedom, which they could win by getting to Canada. People who sympathized were always willing to hide the fugitives and pass them from one place to another until they came within reach of safety. If they were caught, they were carried back to chains and floggings, while their benefactors were liable under law for concealing them. Few laws have been so often broken. Long before the actual climax of the slavery quarrel, the matter of fugitive slaves was a sore point between the North and the South. When in the white heat of the final fury, South Carolina led her sister states out of the Union, she declared that the North had been the first to break the original compact by habitually giving shelter to runaway slaves. Abba and Bronson Alcott were amongst the great number who gave aid and shelter to the contrabands, and thus aided, by one more instance, the growth of the tremendous quarrel which became the Civil War. Louisa Alcott spoke several times on the record of her life of that moment when she saw what slavery really was. Her family think that perhaps the incident took place in Germantown, where the house at Pine Place had a big farmhouse kitchen and a brick oven. The brick oven at Wick was enormous. It is certain that Reuben Haynes and his Quaker friends were strongly against slavery, and that various old houses in town have hiding places still pointed out as the refuge of runaway slaves. But Louisa was only 2 when she left Germantown, and she speaks always of the affair as something which she recollected so vividly that it seems scarcely possible it happened when she was so small. It could not have been in Boston, and almost surely was not in Concord. Fruitlands was somewhat out of the ordinary line of travel for the escaping contrabands, yet all through New England there are places, as at Germantown, where they have been hidden. We cannot be sure where and when she saw that terrified face in the darkness, But we do know that she never forgot it, and that it helped to bring her to a great resolve in later years, even when she was only 11. It was about slavery as well as about many other great and small things that she wondered as she sat on the hillside above Fruitlands. The grain was tall in the sloping fields, growing even more rapidly than young Louisa. The apples were swelling on the trees. Summer was passing. So many questions had been asked about the new experiment that the philosophers found themselves too often called from their work to explain their ideas and principles to others. It was beginning to be time for the harvest. Everyone was anxious to make sure that the barley, which was to be the chief crop of the newly broken Everyone was anxious to make sure of the barley, which was to be the chief crop of the newly broken fields. What they had to put in the barn for the winter might make for either the life or the death of the enterprise. Just as the grain was ripe, however, just as it had been cut and stacked to dry, there came a summons to a conference which Bronson and his friends could not put aside. The barley could wait for a little, they were sure, and here was another harvest which they felt more pressing. They trudged away and left Abba, the 4 girls, and young William Lane to take care of the farm. One day passed calmly, but by the next, trouble began to threaten. The merciless warning of a northeast storm was in the sky. Dark clouds were rolling up. Wind and lightning showed among the thunderheads. Rain was evidently upon them. The children ran out, bringing baskets and bags, anything in which grain could be carried. Abba snatched from the pine chest her Russian linen sheets and ran after the others. The sheets were spread upon the ground. The little crew of harvesters worked like ants, and they carried their loads to the barn, then rushed back panting. The big sheaves almost upset the smaller workers. The grain spilled down their necks, and the stubble was harsh and sharp beneath their running feet. But by the time the storm broke, the bulk of the crop was safe under the big barn roof. There was something, at least, put away for the winter. There was corn to harvest later, and again the children helped, this time with the husking, which went on into the night. Lit by lamps in the barn, it was beginning to grow cold now. Searching winds swept down from the highlands and played at will through the drafty old house. The band of philosophers had dwindled. Hard work had quenched the enthusiasm of some. Cold and discomfort hastened the going of others. Charles Lane and his son would not give up, nor would Bronson Alcott. But he and Lane would have long talks in the little study away from the main room. The girls, passing the door, would hear such unaccustomed words spoken as money, crops, income. Louisa never knew just when it was that she began to feel the stirring of change in the air and realized that a chill cloud of desperate trouble was slowly settling down upon them all. Her father had worked like a dozen men upon the farm in the restless determination to make it produce enough to feed them all. He was always tired, but it was not weariness which shadowed his countenance now. Abba Alcott's deep eyes followed him wherever he went about the house. She herself was worn to the verge of exhaustion, but she toiled unfalteringly at her daily work. The look on her own strong face was not one of mere anxiety, it was terror. They had celebrated Elizabeth's birthday in June, in perfect fashion, with a little tree in the woods, decked with presents, with a procession winding up the path, singing as it went to the music of Charles Lane's violin. William Lane and the girls had lessons with their father, and instruction in music from Lane. They shared all the tasks together, the children and Abba sometimes helping to rake hay in the fields, Bronson often doing the cooking, Lane having been known to assist with the washing. It was all very gay at first, but it was gay no longer. Louisa's birthday came, and her father's, both on the 29th of November, but the snow day was little more than barely noticed as a festival. Our way has gone wrong, Bronson was heard to voice his despair at last, as he and his friend sat in the study. Lane, apparently not so much disturbed as his companion, answered in an eager stream of talk, through which one phrase sounded plainly, again and again. The Shaker community has succeeded where we have failed. Across the river, on the slope of the hill opposite, stood the Shaker village with its plain houses, its spreading orchards, and broad, well-tilled fields. They were a body of people who also owned all property in common and did their work by sharing the tasks. The men lived in one building and the women in another, for they did not believe in marriage and thought there should be no such things as wives and husbands and households with children. The government turned over to their care the orphans and foundlings, which today are brought up in state homes. These children lived all together in common nurseries. They had good food and sensible training, but, so Louisa and Anna must have wondered as they looked at those gray buildings beyond the hill, did they have enough love? Did the babies ever cry for someone to rock them? Did the older girls ever long for a person so near and dear as to be almost a part of oneself? A person like mother. Life at Fruitlands was strange and hard, but the little Alcott girls did not know it. So surrounded were they by love and watchfulness that the discomforts and privations, which crept more and more into their days, did not seem to matter. What did matter was that these two beloved ones, who were their whole world, were growing day by day more sorrowful and desperate. Often, and then oftener, Bronson Alcott and Charles Lane would walk away over the hill to the Shaker village, and Abba Alcott, the girl's mother, would watch them from the window. One night, Louisa, slipping into bed with her sister, felt Anna's firm body suddenly shaken with sobs. The two clung together, weeping wildly in fully admitted terror. "What is it?" Louisa questioned desperately. It was something about Mr. Lane, Anna explained. She had got an inkling of the truth, that Lane thought they ought not to be there. Abba, Anna, Louise, and the little girls. He was trying to persuade Bronson to give them up, to live as the Shakers did, and to forget that he had any children, or that they ever were a family. Louisa's heart stood still at the very thought. Few children loved their parents and each other as did the little Alcotts. They had so little else, but they at least had one another. Louisa's strong, warm nature held passionately to her dreaming father, to her devoted, toil-driven mother, to the two smaller ones, gentle-spirited Elizabeth and May of the vigorous will. She had the feeling that she wanted to protect them as well as to love them. She knew, even in her child's mind, that her mild visionary father, with his great ideas, needed them all to help him keep safely in the path of ordinary life. Charles Lane might insist that, for the sake of a tremendous purpose, a man ought to give up such small things as family love, loyalty, and devotion to one's own. He did not know that it is upon such things that the very structure of life is built. It was in those dark and desperate days that Louisa learned to know the truth of what family life should be, learned it and never forgot. Did the support of the dear Pilgrim's Progress help them then? I think that it must have, that each one of them thought of that immortal ordeal and gathered some courage from it. There is a glorious passage when Christina, the mother of the family, goes down into the river without fear or hesitation to reach the beauty of the life beyond. Abba must have felt that she was crossing some such river of doubt and terror now, must have felt the water very cold about her knees as she girded her fortitude and waited. No discussion of the matter passed between her and the older girls, but they all three understood one another. Everything in Louisa's life after shows how fully she understood what was threatening them then. One thing Bronson Alcott believed, in which he was right 70 years before other people began to see the same truth. He maintained that children had minds and hearts and spirits of their own, and should have a voice in what was decided concerning them. It was a portentous moment in the history of them all, when he finally acted upon that belief. On a certain evening when Charles Lane was temporarily away, Bronson called a family council and laid the matter before them all. He and his wife and the two older girls faced the issue squarely. Should they separate for the sake of Bronson's idea, or should they keep together? There was no question of what the children thought. Anna and Louisa were able to speak their passionate desire. The smaller ones, feeling vaguely that something was wrong, merely cried and clung to their father. Abba Alcott, even now, did not say a great deal. He must do what he felt was best, she told him, but he must be sure what was best. He listened with bent head. He could make no decision even now. Next day, Charles Lane came home. Then suddenly everything was settled. The children, perhaps nobody ever knew just how it came about. The children, perhaps nobody ever knew how it just how it came about. Charles Lane and his son were gone, after some scene with Bronson Alcott, of which, happily, there is now no record. In that bare house, with the December blast whirling about, the Alcotts all gathered fearfully close together before the hearth, safe from being torn asunder. But something had happened to the children's father. Louisa stared at him as he sat in his chair, looking about at them with a broken smile. He was happy to be with them, but the fearful struggle had shattered him. He was worn out. He was ill unto death. He had worked so desperately on the Fruitlands farm, trying to draw from those unwilling acres a living for his family, for his companions and his idea. He was tired with this outward struggle. He was still more worn from the battle of doubt within. The children, with round eyes of terror, saw him lying on his bed, finally, lying there day after day, too ill to move, to speak, or eat. It seemed as though, after all, he was going away from them. Abba Alcott's unbroken spirit still stood firm in that house as the days passed. From her, the girls learned to see that, when all else fails, courage is the only thing left to cling to. Courage and faith in God. The slow days crept by as the illness increased and then spent itself, until rest and untiring care and returning peace of mind began to accomplish their ends. Bronson Alcott was courageous too. He had seen his great experiment fail in spite of everything he dared to put into it. Although he had fallen into some errors, he had been wise enough in the very last hours of despair to know that he was mistaken. He had refused, finally, to wreck the lives of his beloved ones, even though he felt that he had wrecked his own. Strength and health began to come back very slowly, as little by little he was drawn away from the open door of death. Abba's devoted, understanding brother came to her aid in this desperate situation. He had never failed to appreciate Bronson. Through the help of Samuel May, she was able to rent a house in the nearby town of Still River, a house dignified enough to boast a name of its own, Brick Ends. As soon as Bronson was sufficiently recovered, they left the drafty bare farmhouse and moved their few remaining possessions to the village. It was very different from the gay arrival in June, the day when they set out on the journey away from Fruitlands. Bronson Alcott, still helplessly ill, was carried out of the house and laid, wrapped in blankets, upon a wood sledge. That was the easiest way to take him over the rough road to Still River. Anna walked beside him, his gentle, unquestioning daughter, who had wondered and suffered over all this incomprehensible affair, but who took it as it came, with no rebellion or protest of her own. Louisa came behind, one rapid thought treading fast upon the heels of another. How was this strange adventure to end? Where were they going now, and what were they to do? They were together, at least, and, as long as she lived, she was going to battle against everything that might try to separate them. People who loved one another must stand together. So far, she, who was barely 11 years old, had been able to do this. She had only stood by. So far, she who was barely 11 years old had been able to do little. She had only stood by and watched the peril coming closer. But she could help soon. She must help. She would help always. Her old comrade, the wind, was sweeping and calling all across the hill. But she had no time to turn back for a last run with him. Louisa Alcott, as she trudged away over the snow, had set her face determinedly toward the real adventures of life. And that's the end of chapter 3.